Chapter 3: The Transformation of the Libido, a Possible Source of Primitive Human Discoveries. In the following pages I will endeavor to picture a concrete example of the transition of the libido. I once treated a patient who suffered from a depressive catatonic condition. The case was of only a slight introversion psychosis, therefore the existence of many hysterical features was not surprising. In the beginning of the analytic treatment, while telling of a very painful occurrence, she fell into a hysterical, dreamy state in which she showed all signs of sexual excitement. For obvious reasons, she lost the knowledge of my presence during the condition. The excitement led to a masturbative act, fricto femorum. This act was accompanied by a peculiar gesture. She made a very violent rotary motion, with the forefinger of the left hand on the left temple, as if she were boring a hole there. Afterwards, there was complete amnesia for what had happened, and there was nothing to be learned about the queer gesture with her hand. Although this act can easily be likened to a boring into the mouth, nose, or ear, now transferred to the temple, it belongs in the territory of the infantile ludus sexualis, to the preliminary exercise preparatory to sexual activity. Without really understanding it, this gesture nevertheless seems very important to me. Many weeks later, I had an opportunity to speak to the patient's mother. From her, I learned that her daughter had been a very exceptional child. When only 2 years old, she would sit with her back to open cupboard doors for hours and rhythmically beat her head against the door. To the distraction of the household a little later, instead of playing as other children, she began to bore a hole with her fingers into the plaster of a wall of the house. She did this with little turning and scraping movements, and kept herself busy at this occupation for hours. She was a complete puzzle for her parents. From her 4th year she practiced ornerism. It is evident that in this early infantile activity, the preliminary stage of a later trouble may be found. The especially remarkable features in this case are first that the child did not carry out the action on its own body, and secondly the astuity with which it carried on the action. One is tempted to bring these two facts into a causal relationship and to say, is the child does not accomplish this action on her own body, perhaps that is the reason of the assiduity. For by boring into the wall, she never arrives at the same satisfaction as if she executed the activity onistically on her own body. The very evident onistic boring of a patient can be traced back to a very early stage of childhood, which is prior to the period of local onanism. That time is still psychologically very obscure, because individual reproductions and memories are lacking to a great extent. The same is among animals. The race characteristics, manner of life predominate during the entire life of the animal, whereas among men the individual character asserts itself over the race type. Granting the correctness of this remark, we are struck with apparently wholly incomprehensible individual activity of this child at this early age. We learn from her later life history that her development, which is, as is always the case, intimately interwoven with the parallel external events, has led to that mental disturbance which is especially well known on account of its individual and originality of its productions. The peculiarity of this disturbance has been pointed out above, dependent upon the predominance of the fantastic form of thought of the infantile in general. From this type of thinking proceeded all those numerous contacts with mythological products, and that which we consider as original and wholly individual creations are very often creations which are comparable with nothing but those of antiquity. I believe that this comparison can be applied to all formations of this remarkable illness, perhaps also to the special symptom of boring. You have already seen this onistic boring patient dated from a very early stage of childhood. That is to say, it was reproduced from that period of the past. The sick woman fell back for the first time into the early ornerism, only this time she had been married many years, and following the death of her child, with whom she had identified herself through an overindulgent love. When the child died, the still healthy mother was overcome by early infantile symptoms in the form of scarcely concealed fits of masturbation, which were associated with the very act of boring. As already observed, The primary boring appeared at a time which preceded the infantile onanism localized in the genitals. This fact is of significance in so far as this boring differs thereby from a similar later practice, which appeared after vaginital onanism. The later bad habits represent as a rule a substitution for repressed genital masturbation or for an attempt in this direction. As such, these habits, finger-sucking, biting the nails, picking at things, boring into the ears and nose, etc., may pursue far into adult life as regular symptoms of a repressed amount of libido. As has already been shown above, the libido in youthful individuals at first manifests itself in the nutritional zone. When food is taken in the act of suckling with rhythmic movements, and with every sign of satisfaction with the growth of the individual and the development of the organs, the libido creates for itself new avenues to supply its need of activity and satisfaction. The primary model of rhythmic activity producing pleasure and satisfaction must now be transferred to the zone of other functions, with sexuality as its final goal. A considerable part of the hunger libido is transferred into the sexual libido. This transition does not take place suddenly at the time of puberty, as it generally supposed, but very gradually in the course of the greater part of childhood. The libido can free itself only with difficulty and very slowly from that which is peculiar to the function of nutrition. In order to enter into the peculiarity of the sexual function, two periods are to be distinguished in this state of transition so far as I can judge: the epoch of suckling and the epoch of the displaced rhythmic activity. Suckling still belongs to the function of nutrition, but passes beyond it. However, in that it is no longer the function of nutrition, but rhythmic activity of pleasure and satisfaction as a goal, without the taking of nourishment. Here the hand enters as an auxiliary organ. In the period of displaced rhythmic activity, the hand appears still more clearly as an auxiliary organ. The gaining of pleasure leaves the mouth and turns to other regions. The possibilities are now many. As a rule, other openings of the body become the objects of a libido interest, then the skin and special portions of that. The activity expressed in these parts, which can appear as rubbing, boring, picking, and so on, follows a certain rhythm and serves to produce pleasure. After longer or shorter tearings of the libido at these stations, it passes onward until it reaches the sexual zone, and there for the first time can be occasion for the beginning of the onanistic attempts. In its migration, the libido takes more than little of the function of nutrition with it into the sexual zone, which readily amounts for the numerous and innate correlations between the functions of nutrition and sexuality. After the occupation of the sexual zone, an obstacle arises against the present form of applications of libido. Then there occurs, according to the well-known laws, a regression of the nearest station lying behind to the two above-mentioned periods. It is now of special importance that the epoch of a displaced rhythmic activity coincides in a general way with the time of the development of the mind and of speech. I might designate the period from birth until the occupation of the sexual zone as the pre-sexual stage of development. This generally occurs between the third and fifth year and is comparable to the chrysalis stage in butterflies. It is distinguished by the irregular commingling of the element of nutrition and of sexual functions. Certain regressions follow directly back to the pre-sexual stage, and judging from my experience, this seems to be the rule in the regression of dementia precox. I will give two brief examples. One case concerns a young girl who developed a catonic state during her engagement. When she saw me for the first time, she came up suddenly, embraced me, and said, "Papa, give me something to eat." The other case concerns a young maid-servant who complained that people pursued her with electricity, and that this caused a queer feeling in her genitals as if it ate and drank down there. These regressive phenomena show that even from a distance of the modern mind, those early stages of libido can be regressively reached. One may assume, therefore, that in the earliest stages of human development, this road was much more easily traveled than it is today. It becomes then a matter of great interest to learn whether traces of this have been preserved in history. We owe our knowledge to the ethnologic fantasy of boring to the valuable work of Abraham, who refers us to the writings of Adalbert Kuhn. Through this investigation, we learn that Prometheus, the fire-bringer, may be a brother of the Hindu Pramantha, that is to say, of the masculine fire-rubbing piece of wood. The Hindu fire-bringer is called Matrikdikian, and the activity of fire preparation is always designated in the hieratic text of the verb manthami, which means shaking, rubbing, bringing forth by rubbing. Kuhn has put these verbs in connection with the Greek, which means to learn, and has explained the conceptual relationship. The tertium comparisons might lie in the rhythm, the movement, to and through in the mind. According to Kuhn, the root manth or math must be traced, who is in the Greek fire robber, through an unauthorized Sanskrit word, Parametheus, which comes by way of Pramantha, and which possesses the double meaning of rubber and robber. The transition of Prometheus was effected. With that, however, the prefix pra caused a special difficulty, so that the whole derivation was doubled by a series of offers, and was held in part as erroneous. On the other hand, it was pointed out that as the ferric Zeus bore the especially interesting cognomen, thus might not be an original Indo-Germanic term that was related to the Sanskrit Pramantha, but might represent only a cognomen. This interpretation is supported by a gloss of Hesychius. Another gloss of Hesychius explained, through which attains the meaning of the flaming one, analogous to the relationship of Prometheus to Pramantha, could scarcely be so direct as Kuhn conjectures. The question of an indirect relationship is not decided. That, above all, is of a great significance as a surname. Since the flaming one is the forefinger, Pramati equals precaution is also an attribute to Agni, although Pramati is of another derivation. Prometheus, however, belongs to the line of Phlegians, which was placed by Kuhn in uncontested relationship to the Indian priest family of Burgu. The Burgu are like Matatrivian, the one swelling, and the mother, also fire-bringers. Kuhn quotes a passage according to which Burgu also arises from the flame like Agni, and the flame Burgu originated. Burgu roasted but did not burn. The view leads to a root related to Burgu, that is to say, to the Sanskrit brai, to light, Latin fulego, and Greek Sanskrit bargus, splendor, Latin fulgur. Burgu appears therefore as the shining one, a certain species of eagle on account of its burnished color. The connection with Olu, which signifies to burn, is clear. The Phlegians are also the fire eagles. Prometheus also belongs to the Phlegians. The path from Pramantha to Prometheus passes not through the word, but through the idea, and therefore we should adopt the same meaning for Prometheus as that which Pramantha attains, from Hindu fire symbolism. The Pramantha as the tool of the Manthana of the fire sacrifice is considered purely sexual in the Hindu. The Pramantha as phallus or man, the board wood underneath as vulva or women. The resulting fire is the child of the divine son, Agni. The two pieces of wood are called in the cult Purvasas and Uvarsai, were thought of personified as man and woman. The fire was born from the genitals of the woman. An especially interesting representation of a fire production as a religious ceremony, Manthana, is given by Weber. A certain sacrificial fire was lit by the rubbing together of the two sticks. One piece of wood is taken up with the words, "Thou art the birthplace of the fire," and two blades of grass are placed upon it, yea, two testicles to the Adrahini, the underlying wood. Thou art Uvarsi, the Utarni, that which is placed on top is anointed with butter. Thou art power. This is in place on the Ardahini, thou art Peruvians, and both are rubbed 3 times. I rub 3 with the Gari, our 2 women. I rub 3 with the Hittite butter women. I rub thee with the Jaxortherium. The sexual symbolism of a fire production is unmistakable. We see here also the rhythm. The meter in its original place is sexual rhythm. Rising above the mating call into music's a song of a rivagati conveys the same interpretation and symbolism. Here is the gear for function. Here tinder made ready for the spark. Bring thou the matron. We will rub Agni into ancient fashion forth. And the two fire sticks Yarvidus lafe even as the well-formed germ in pregnant women. Agni, who day by day must be exalted by men who watch and worship with oblations. Lay this with care on which lies extended, straight hath she borne the steer when made prolific. With his red pillar radiant in his splendor, and our skilled task is born of son of La. Book 3. Side by side with the unequivocal coitus symbolism, we see that the Parampha is also Agni, the created sun. The phallus is a sun, or the sun is the phallus. Therefore, Agni in Vedic mythology was the threefold character. With this, we are once more connected with the above-mentioned Kabric father-son cult. In the modern German language, we have preserved echoes of the primitive symbols. A boy is designated as Bengal, short, thick piece of wood, and Haitian is stiff for Balzen, arrow, wooden peg, or stump. The Artemisia artibornum, which is called German stabwort, stick root, is called English boy's love. The vulgar designation of a penis's boy was remarked even by Grimm and others. The ceremonial production of fire was retained in Europe as late as the 19th century as a superstition custom. Kuhn mentions such a case even in the year 1828, which occurred in Germany. The solemn magic ceremony was called the Naderfeuer, the fire of need, and the charm was chiefly used against cattle epidemics. Kuhn cites from the Chronicle of Lanzarote of the year 1268 an especially noteworthy case of a Nodfear, the ceremonies of which plainly reveal the fundamental phallic meaning. These examples, which allow us to recognize a clear sexual symbolism in the generalization of fire, prove therefore, since they originate from different times and different peoples, the existence of a universal tendency to credit to fire production not only a magical but also a sexual significance. The ceremonial or magic repetition of this very ancient, long-outlived observance shows how insistently the human mind clings to the old forms, and how deeply rooted in this very ancient reminiscence of fire-boring. One might almost be inclined to see in the sexual symbolism of fire production a relatively late addition to the priestly lore. This may indeed be true for the ceremonial elaboration of the fire mysteries, but whether originally the generation of fire was in general a sexual action, that is to say a coitus play, is still a question. That similar things occur among very primitive people we learn from the Australian tribe of the Washantis, who in the spring perform the following magic ceremonies of fertilization. They dig a hole in the ground, so formed and surrounded with bushes as the counterfeit of women's genitals. They dance the night long around this hole, in connection with they hold spears in front of themselves, in a manner to recall the penis in erection. They dance around the hole and thrust their spears into the ditch, while they cry to it, Puli Nira Wakata. Such obscene dances appear among other primitive races as well. In this spring incantation are contained the elements of a coitus play. This play is nothing but a coitus game, that is to say, originally this play was simply a coitus in the form of sacramental mating, which for a long time was a mysterious element among certain cults, and reappeared in sex. In the ceremonies of Zinzeroth's followers, echoes of a coitus sacrament may be recognized also in other sects. One can easily think that just as the above-mentioned Australian bushmen performed the coitus play in this manner, the same performance could be enacted in another manner, and indeed in the form of fire production. Instead of through two selected human beings, the coitus is represented by two substitutes, the Peruvians and the Uvarsi, by phallus and vulva, by borer and opening. Just as primitive thought behind other customs is really the sacramental collision, so here the primal tendency is really the act itself, for the act of fertilization is the climax, the true festival of life and well worthy to become the nucleus of a religious mystery. We are justified in concluding that the symbolism of the hole in the earth used by the Shantis for the fertilization of the earth takes the place of a coitus, and the generation of fire could be considered in the same way as a substitute for coitus. Indeed, it might be further concluded as a consequence of this reasoning that the invention of fire-making is also due to the need of supplying a symbol for the sexual act. Let us return for a moment to the infantile symptom of boring. Let us imagine a strong adult man carrying on a boring with 2 pieces of wood and the same perseverance and the energy corresponding to that of his child. He may very easily create fire by this play, but of greatest significance in this work is the rhythm. The hypothesis seems to me psychologically possible, although it should not be said that this was only in this way could the discovery of fire occur. It can result just as well by the striking together of flints. It is scarcely possible that fire was created in only one way. All I want to establish here is merely the psychologic process, the symbolic indications of which point to the possibility that in such a way was fire invented or prepared. The existence of a primitive coitus play of a rite seems to me sufficiently proven. The only thing that is obscure is the energy and emphasis of a ritual play. It is well known that those primitive rites were often of very bloody seriousness, and were performed with an extraordinary display of energy, which appears as a great contrast to the well-known indolence of primitive humanity. Therefore, the ritual activity entirely loses the character of play, and wins that of purposeful effort. If certain Negro races can dance the whole night long to 3 tones in the most monotonous manner, then according to our idea, there is in this an absolute lack of the character of play pastime. It approaches nearer to exercise. There seems to exist a sort of compulsion to transfer the libido into such ritual activity. If the basis of the ritual activity is the sexual act, we may assume that it is really the underlying thought and object of the exercise. Under these circumstances, the question arises why the primitive man endeavors to represent the sexual act of symbolically and with effort, or if this wording appears to be hypothetical. Why does he exert energy to such a degree only to accomplish practically useless things, which apparently do not especially amuse him? It may be assumed that the sexual act is more desirable to primitive man than such absurd man, and moreover fatiguing exercises. It is hardly possible but a certain compulsion conducts the energy away from the original object and real purpose, inducing the production of surrogates. The existence of a phallic or orgistatic culture that does not indicate ipso a particular lavishly life and more than that aesthetic symbolism of Christianity, and especially moral life. One honors that which one does not possess or that which one is not. The compulsion to speak in the nomenclature formulated above removes a certain amount of libido from the real sexual activity and creates a symbolic and practically valid substitute for why it is lost. This psychology is confirmed by the above-mentioned watch-inside ceremony. During the entire ceremony, none of the men may look at a woman. This detail again informs us from whence the libido is to be diverted, but this gives rise to the pressing question. Whence comes this compulsion? We have already suggested above that the primitive sexuality encounters a resistance, which leads to a sidetracking of the libido to a substitution actions. It is unthinkable that it is a question of any outer opposition whatsoever, or of a real obstacle, since it occurs to no savage to catch his elusive quarry with ritual charms. But it is a question of an internal resistance. Will opposes will, libido opposes libido, since the psychologic resistance as an energetic phenomena corresponds to a certain amount of libido. The psychologic compulsion for the transformation of libido is based on an original division of the will. I will return to this primal splitting of the libido in another place. Here let us concern ourselves only with the problem of the transition of libido. The transition takes place, as has already been repeatedly suggested, by means of shifting to an analogy. The libido is taken away from its proper place and transferred to another substratum. The resistance against sexuality aims therefore at preventing the sexual act. It also seeks to crowd the libido away from the sexual function. We see, for example, in hysteria how the specific repression blocks the real path of transference, therefore the libido is obliged to take another path, and that an earlier one, namely the incestuous road which ultimately leads to the parents. Let us speak, however, of the incest prohibition, which hindered the very first sexual transference. Then the situation changes insofar that no earlier way of transference is left except that of a pre-sexual stage of development. Where the libido was still partly in the function of nutrition, by a regression of pre-sexual material, the libido becomes quasi-desexualized. But as the incest prohibition signifies only a temporary and conditional restriction of his sexuality, thus only that part of the libido which is best designated as the incestuous component is now pushed back to the pre-sexual stage. The repression therefore concerns only part of the sexual libido which wishes to fix itself permanently upon the parents. The sexual libido is only withdrawn from the incestuous component repressed upon the pre-sexual stage, and there, if the operation is successful, desexualized, by which this amount of libido is prepared for an asexual application. However, it is to be assumed that this operation is accomplished only with difficulty, because the incestuous libido, so to speak, must be artificially separated from the sexual libido, with which for ages through the whole animal kingdom it was indistinguishably united. The regression of the incestuous component must therefore take place, not only with great difficulty, but also carry with it into the pre-sexual stage a considerable sexual character. The consequence of this is that the resulting phenomena, according stamped with character of a sexual act, are nevertheless not really sexual acts de facto. They are derived from the pre-sexual stage and are maintained by the repressed sexual libido, therefore possesses a double significance. Thus the fire boring is a coitus, and to be sure an incestuous one, but a desexualized one which has lost its immediate sexual worth, and is therefore indirectly useful to the propagation of the species. The pre-sexual stage is characterized by countless possibilities of application, because libido has not yet formed definite localizations. It therefore appears intelligible that an amount of libido which reaches this stage for regression is confronted with manifold possibilities of application. Above all, it is met with the possibility of a purely onanistic activity, but as the matter in question and the regressive component of libido is sexual libido, the ultimate object of which is propagation. Therefore it goes to the external object which is parents. It will also introvert with this destination as its essential character. The result, therefore, is that the purely onanistic activity turns out to be insufficient, and another object must be sought for which takes the place of the incest object. The nurturing Mother Earth represents the ideal example of such an object. The psychology of the pre-sexual stage contributes the nutrition component. The sexual libido, the coitus idea. From the ancient symbols of agriculture arise. In the work of agriculture, hunger and incest intermingle. The ancient cults of Mother Earth and all the superstitions founded thereon saw in the cultivation of the earth the fertilization of a mother. The aim of the action is desexualized, however, for it is the fruit of the field and the nourishment contained therein. The regression resulting from the incest prohibition leads in this case to the new valuation of a mother. This time, however, not as a sexual object, but as a nourisher. The discovery of fire seems to be due to a very similar regression to pre-sexual stage, more particularly to the nearest stage of a displaced rhythmic manifestation. The libido introverted from the incest prohibition with a more detailed designation of the motor components of coitus. When it reaches the presexual stage, meets the related infantile boring, to which it now gives in accordance with realistic destination. An actual material, therefore the material is fittingly called materia, as the object is the mother, as above. As I sought to show above, the action of the infantile boring requires only the strength and perseverance of an adult man in suitable material. In order to generate fire, if this is so, it may be expected that analogous to our foregoing case of the ornastic being of generation of fire originally occurred as such an act of quasi-ontistic activity, objectively expressed. The demonstration of this can never be actually furnished, but it is thinkable that somewhere traces of the original onastic preliminary exercise of fire production have been preserved. I have succeeded in finding a passage in a very old monument of Hindu literature which contains this transition of the sexual libido through the ornastic phase in the preparation of fire. This passage is found in Berklavinia Upanishad. In truth was as large as a woman and a man when they embrace each other. This his own self he divided into two parts, one of which his husband and wife were formed. With her he copulated from the humanity sprang. However pondered, how may he unite with me after he was created me from himself? Now I shall hide. Then she became a cow, he however became a bull, and mated with her. From that sprang the horned cattle. Then she became a mare, he however became a stallion. She became a she-ras, he an ass, and mated with her. From these sprang the whole-hoofed animals, and became a goat. He became a buck, she became an ewe. He became a ram and mated with her. Thus were created goats and sheep. Thus it happened that all that mates, even down to the ants, he created when he perceived. Truly I myself am creation, for I have created the whole world. Thereupon he rubbed his hands, held before the mouth, so that he brought forth fire from his mouth, as from the mother womb, and from his hands. We meet here a peculiar myth of creation which requires a psychologic interpretation. In the beginning, the libido was undifferentiated and bisexual. This was followed by differentiation into a male and female component. From then on, man knows what he is. Now follows a gap in the coherence of a thought where belongs this very resistance which we have postulated above for the explanation of the urge for sublimation. Next follows the ornastic act of rubbing or boring, here finger sucking transferred from the sexual zone, from which proceeds the production of fire. The libido here leaves its characteristic manifestation as sexual function and regresses to the pre-sexual stage, where in conformity with the above explanation it occupies one of the preliminary stages of sexuality, thereby producing in the view expressed in the upandish in the first human art and form there. As suggested by Kuhn's idea of a root math, perhaps to higher intellectual activity in general. This course of development is not strange to the psychiatrist, for it is well known psychopathological fact that onanism and excessive activity of fantasy are very closely related. The sexualizing autonomizing of the mind through autoeroticism is so familiar a fact that examples of that are superfluous. The course of libido, as we may conclude from these studies, originally proceeded in a similar manner as in the child, only in reverse sequence. The sexual act was pushed out of its proper zone and was transferred into the analogous mouth zone. The mouth receiving the significance of the female genitals, the hand and the fingers respectively receiving the phallic meaning. In this manner the regressively reoccupied activity of the presexual stage is invested with a sexual significance, which indeed it already possessed in part therefore, but in a wholly different Since certain functions of a presexual stage are found to be permanently suitable and therefore are retained later on as sexual functions. Thus, for example, the mouth zone is retained as one of erotic importance, meaning that its valuation is permanently fixed. Concerning the mouth, we know that it also has a sexual meaning among animals, inasmuch as, for example, stallions bite Mars with sexual acts. Also cats, cocks, etc. A second significance of a mouth is as an instrument of speech. It serves essentially in the production of a mating call, which mostly represents the developed tones of the animal kingdom. As to the hand, we know that it is the important significance of a consecration organ, for example, among frogs. The frequent erotic use of a wand among monkeys is well known. If there exists a resistance among the real sexuality, then the accumulated libido is most likely to cause a hyperfunction of those collaterals, which are the most adapted to compensate for the resistance. That is to say, the nearest function which serves for the introduction of the act. On one side of the function of the hand, on the other that of the mouth. The sexual act, however, against which the opposition is directed, is replaced by a similar act of the presexual stage, the classic case being either finger-sucking or boring. Just as among apes, the foot can on occasion take the place of the hand, so the child is often uncertain in the choice of the object to suck, and puts the big toe in the mouth instead of the finger. This last movement belongs to a Hindu rite. Only big toe was not put in the mouth, but held against the eye. For the sexual significance of the hand and mouth, these organs, which in the presexual stage serve to obtain pleasure, are invested with a procreating power which is identical with the above-mentioned destination, which aims at the external object because it concerns the sexual or creating libido. When through the actual preparation of fire the sexual character of the libido employed in that is fulfilled, then the mouth remains without adequate expression. Only the hand has now reached its real purely human goal in its first art. The mouth has, as we saw, a further important function, which has just as much sexual relation to the object as the hand, that is to say, the production of a mating call. In opening up the autoerotic ring, hand-mouth, where the phallic hand becomes the fire-producing tool, the libido which was directed to the mouth zone was obliged to seek another path of functioning, which naturally was found in the already existing love call. The excess of libido enters here, must have had the usual results, namely the simulation of a newly possessed function, hence an elaboration of a mating call. We know that from the primitive sounds human speech has developed. Corresponding to the psychological situation, it might be assumed that language owes its real origin to the moment when the impulse repressed into the presexual stage turns into the external, in order to find an equivalent object there. The real thought as a conscious activity is, as we saw in the first part of this book, of thinking with positive determination towards the external world, that is to say, speech thinking. This sort of thinking seems to have originated at that moment. It is very remarkable that this view, which was won by the path of reasoning, is again supported by old tradition and other mythological fragments. The following quotation is to be found on the doctrine of the development of man. Being brooded o'er, his mouth hatched out like an egg. From out his mouth came speech, from speech the fire. In part 2, where it is depicted how the newly created objects entered man, it reads, fire speech becoming entered in the mouth. These quotations allow us to plainly recognize the intimate connection between fire and speech. In this foreign passage, we notice that fire again stands in the closest relation to speech. Speech itself is called the light, which in its turn is reduced to the light of the atom, the creating psychic force, the libido. Thus the Hindu metapsychology conceives speech and fire as emanations of the inner light from which we know that it is libido. Speech and fire are its forms of manifestation, the first human arts, which have resulted from its transformation. This common psychological origin seems also to be indicated by certain results of philology, the Indo-Germanic root, the idea of delighten or to shine. This root is found in Greek and Old Icelandic and New High German to make shining. The same root ba also designates to speak. It is found in Sanskrit, Armenian, and New High German, Greek, and Latin. Related roots lezo with the meaning desire he also found in the Sanskrits. A further related root, a shine to radiate, is found to radiate or to shine. This group unites, as is evident, the meaning of to desire, to play, to radiate, and to sound. A similar archaic confluence of meanings in the primal libido symbolism, as we are perhaps justified in calling it, is found in that class of Egyptian words which are derived from the closely related roots ben and bel, and their replication ben and bel. The original significance of these roots is to burst forth, to emerge, to extrude, to well out, with the associated ideas of bubbling, boiling, and roundness. Bell accompanied by the sign of obelisk, the originally phallic nature, means source of light. The obelisk itself had, besides the names of Tekenu and Men, also the name Ben, more rarely Bur, and Bel. The libido symbolism makes clear this connection, it seems to me. The Indo-Germanic root vel, with the meaning to wave, to undilute fire, is found in Sanskrit Alanka, burning, in Greek and Attic, warmth of the sun. Gothic Vulcan is to undulate, Old High Germanic and Middle High German, walm, heat, and glow. The idea of the Sanskrit suggests the fundamental significance of libido for the conception of a world in general. I am indebted to Dr. Abegg in Zurich, a thorough Sanskrit scholar, for the compilation of 8 meanings of this word. Teha signifies sharpness, cutting edge, fire, splendor, light, glow, heat, healthy appearance, and beauty. The fire and color producing power of the human organism thought to be in bile, power, energy, vital force, passionate in nature, mental, also magic strength, influence, position, indignity, and sperma. This gives us a dim idea of how for primitive thought the so-called objective world was and had to be a subjective image. To this thought must be applied the words of chorus mystics. All that is perishable is only an allegory. The Sanskrit word for fire is Agnis, the Latin Ignis. The fire personified in the god Agni, the divine mediator, whose symbol has certain points of contact with that of Christ. In Avesta and in Vedas, the fire is the messenger of the gods. In the Christian mythology, certain parts are closely related with the myth of Agni. Daniel speaks of the 3 men in the fiery furnace. Then Nuben Cockdenzander the king was astonished, and rose up in haste, and spake, and said unto his counselors, Did not we cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said, True, O king. He answered and said, Lo, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of a fire, and they have no hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. In regard to that, there'll be a pauper on him, observes according to the old German incubation of 1471. One reads the 3rd chapter of the prophet Daniel that Nubenzaker, the king, caused 3 men to be placed in a glowing furnace, that the king often went there, looked in, that he saw with the 3 a 4th who was like the Son of God. The 3 signify for us the Holy Trinity, and the 4th the unity of the being. Christ, too, in his explanation, designated the person of the Trinity and the unity of the being. According to this mystic interpretation, the legend of the three men in the fiery furnace appears as a magic fire ceremony by means of which the Son of God reveals himself. The Trinity is brought together with the unity, or in other words, through coitus, a child is produced. The glowing furnace, like the glowing tripod and faucet, is a mother symbol, where the children are produced. The fourth in the fiery furnace appears as Christ, the Son of God, who has become a visible God in the fire. The mystic Trinity and unity are sexual symbols. Compare with that the many references in Inman, ancient pagan and modern Christian symbolism. It is said of the Savior of Israel, the Messiah, and of his enemies, Isaiah x:17. And the light of Israel shall be for a fire, and his Holy One for a flame. In the hymn of the Syrian Ephraim, it is said to Christ, Thou who art our fire, have mercy upon me. Agni is a sacrificial flame. The sacrificer and the sacrificed is Christ himself. Just as Christ left behind the redeeming blood and the stimulating wine, so Agni and the Soma, the holy drink of inspiration, the meat of immortality. Soma and fire are entirely identical in Hindu literature, so that in Soma we easily rediscover the libido symbol, through which a series of apparently paradoxical qualities of the Soma are immediately explained. As old Hindus recognized in fire an animation of the inner libido, fire, so too they recognized in the intoxicating drink. Fire, Vata, Samata, Agni is rain and fire, an emanation of libido. The Vedic definition of Soma as seminal fluid confirms this interpretation. The Soma signifies a fire similar to the significance of the body of Christ in the Last Supper. Compare the Passover lamb of the Jews, baked in the form of cross, as explained by the psychology of a presexual stage, where the libido was still in part of the function of nutrition. The Soma is the nourishing drink, the mythological characterization of which runs parallel to fire in its origin. Therefore, both are united in Agni. The fire of immortality has stirred by the Hindus' godlike fire. Through the retreat of the libido into the presexual stage, it becomes clear why so many gods were either defined sexually or were devoured. As was shown by our discussion of fire preparation, the fire tool did not receive its sexual significance as a later addition, but the sexual libido was the motor power which led to its discovery, so that the later teachings of the priests were nothing but confirmations of its actual origin. Other primitive discoveries probably have acquired their sexual symbolism in the same manner, being also derived from the sexual libido. In the previous statements, which were based on the Paramatma of Agni, sacrifice, we only concerned ourselves with one significance, of the word manthami or manthamami, that is to say, with which expressed the movements of rubbing. As Kuhn shows, however, this word also possesses the meaning of tearing off, taking away by violence, or robbing. As Kuhn points out, this significance is already extant in the Vedic text. The legend of its discovery always expresses the production of fire as a robbery. In this fire it belongs to the motive, widely spread over the earth, of a treasure difficult to attain. The fact that in many places, and not alone in India, the preparation of fire is represented as having its origin in robbery leads to point to a widely spread thought according to which the preparation of fire was something forbidden, something usurped or criminal, which could be obtained only through stratagem or deeds of violence, mostly through stratagem. When onanism confronts the physician as a symptom, it does so frequently under a symbol of secret pilfering or crafty imposition, which always signifies the concealed fulfillment of forbidden wish. Historically, this train of thought probably implies that the ritual preparation of fire was employed with a magic purpose, and therefore is pursued by official religions. Then it became a ritual mystery, guarded by the priests and surrounded with secrecy. The ritual laws of the Hindus threaten with severe punishment him who prepares fire in an incorrect manner. The fact alone that something is mysterious means the same as something done in concealment, that which must remain secret, which one may not see nor do, also something which is surrounded by severe punishment of body and soul. Therefore, presumably, something forbidden which has received a license as a religious rite. After all has been said about the genesis of the preparation of fire, it is no longer difficult to guess what is the forbidden thing. It is onanism. When I stated before that it might be lack of satisfaction which breaks up the autoerotic ring of the displaced sexual activity transferred to the body itself, and thus opens wider fields of culture. I did not mention that this loosely cracked ring of the displaced onanistic activity could be much more firmly closed when man makes the other great discovery, that of true onanism. With that, the activity is stated in the first proper place, and this under certain circumstances may mean a satisfaction sufficient for a long time, but at the expense of cheating sexuality of its real purpose. It is a fraud upon the natural development of things, because all the dynamic forces which can and should serve the development of culture are withdrawn from it through onanism, since instead of a displacement, a regression to the local sexual takes place, which is precisely the opposite of that which is desirable. Psychologically, however, onanism is a discovery of a significance not to be undervalued. One is protected from fate, since no sexual need then has the power to give one up to life. For the onanism, one has the greatest magic in one's hand. One needs only to fantasy, and with that to masturbate. Then one possesses all the pleasure of the world, and is no longer compelled to conquer the world of one desires through hard labor and wrestling with reality. Aladdin rubs his lamp, and the obedient genie stands at his bidding. Thus the fairy tale expresses the great psychologic advantage of the easy regression to the local sexual satisfaction. Aladdin's symbol subtly confirms the ambiguity of magic fire preparations. The close relation of a generation of fire to the onanistic act is illustrated by a case, the knowledge of which I owe to Dr. Schmid and Sari, that of an imbecile peasant youth who set many incendiary fires. At one of these conflagrations he drew suspicion to himself by his behavior. He stood with his hands in his trouser pockets in the door of an opposite house, and gazed with apparent delight at the fire. Under examination in the insane asylum, he described the fire in great detail and made suspicious movements in his trouser pockets with his hands. The physical examination undertaken at once showed that he had masturbated. Later he confessed they had masturbated at that time when he had enjoyed the fire which he had enkindled himself. The preparation of fire in itself is a perfectly ordinary, useful custom, employed everywhere for many centuries, which in itself involved nothing more mysterious than eating and drinking. However, there was always a tendency from time to time to prepare fire in a ceremonious and mysterious manner, exactly as with ritual eating and drinking, which was to be carried out in an exactly prescribed way, and from one which no one dared differ. This mysterious tendency associated with the technique is the second path into onanistic regression, always present by the side of culture. The strict rules applied to it, the zeal of the ceremonial preparations, and the religious awe of the mysteries, next originate from the source. The ceremonial, although apparently irrational, is an extremely ingenious institution from the psychologic standpoint, for it represents a substitute for the possibility of onanistic regression, accurately circumscribed by law. The law cannot apply to the content of the ceremony, for it is really quite indifferent for the ritual act, and whether it is carried out in this way or in that way. On the contrary, it is very essential whether the restrained libido is discharged through a sterile onanism or transposed into the path of sublimation. These severe measures of protection apply primarily to onanism. I am indebted to Freud to a further important reference to the onanistic nature of a fire theft, or rather the motive of a treasure difficult of attainment, to which fire theft belongs. Mythology contains repeated formulas which read approximately as follows. The treasure must be plucked or torn off from a taboo tree, paradise tree Hesperides. This is a forbidden, dangerous act. The clearest example of this is the old barbaric custom in the service of Diana of Archia. Only he can become a priest of the goddess who in her sacred grove dares to tear off a bow. The tearing off has been reinstated in vulgar speech as a symbol of the act of onanism. Thus, freebane to rub is like risen, to break off, both of which are contained in a mythology and united apparently only through the myth of a fire theft, bound up in the act of onanism in a deeper stratum, wherein raben, properly speaking, risen, is employed but in a transferred sense. Therefore it might perhaps be anticipated that in the deepest stratum, namely the incestuous, which precedes the autoerotic stage, the two meanings coincide, which through lack of mythological tradition can perhaps be traced through etymology only.